Frost ferns the refectory pane, each needle a brittle petition. Sister Felicitas counts 14 mute boots beneath the bench, laces still knotted by fingers now unthreaded from the world. Ink from her ledger bleeds through the linen to her ribs, a second rosary she will never speak. Tallow smoke, scorched barley, and the iron of thawing nails braid into one taste. She swallows, feeling the wafer-cold film settle on her tongue. Then mouths the envoy's promise. Apprenticeships lighten every burden. The sentence tastes of velvet stretched over thorns. Canvas creaks beyond the hatch. The wagon confesses. Iron tires hiss across rime, while a lantern swings beneath the spout. Dying Calder's collar the color of dried blood. He steadies a slack bundle against his hip as 3 gold eagles clink through the cedar slot. Their ring replaces the chapel bell, sealing silence. Flower dust exhales from the yard, settles on her veil like ash, no fire admits. Felicitas fingers the cedar box lid, still warm from coin friction, and imagines the gold already cooling into absence. Inside the dormitory corridor, nightlights tremble, ribs of shadow lengthen across lime wash. She kneels, chalk squeaking once, sketching the vanished boy's height in a single stroke. Frost answers, creeping across the outline until shoulder and heel gleam like salt on dark meat. Blankets rasp behind her, no sleeper calls the missing name, dreams having learned to skirt the hole. Brick dust sifts onto Mother Aurelia's veil in the chapel vault. She crumbles a marigold between her palms, yellow staining the lifeline that once counted virtues. The bell rope hangs unpulled. Her asthmatic whistle syncopates with Felicitas' pulse beyond the infirmary door. Numbers, not blessings, drum inside the treasurer's skull. She wipes iron from her lip, tastes the ledger's ink, and wonders which scuff marks will vanish next. Behind her, the nightlight drowns in its own tallow, darkness soldering the doorway like a lid hammered onto a box. The chalk child keeps breathing frost, soundless, while the gate beyond the yard hangs open, tongue waiting for the next wagon's cough. The wagon's cough never comes. Instead, the yard inhales, a slow, bone-cold draft that lifts the hems of Felicitas's wool cloak and rattles the loose pane in the refectory hatch. She rises from the chalk silhouette, knees cracking like twigs stepped on in secret. The frost outline has thickened, ribs of rime now visible inside the chest she drew. They pulse once, as though the wall itself tries to breathe. She backs away, palms open, ledger pressed to her breast like a shield of paper. Her left thumb, still smudged with ink, leaves a bruise-shaped print on the serge. Somewhere beyond the arch, boot leather shifts against stone, not 14 pairs. Felicitas follows the yellow petals, each one colder than the last, until she stands where the strong box once sat. Only an afterimage remains, 3 dull circles in the cedar, lighter than the surrounding wood, as if the coins burned their silhouette before vanishing. She touches the ghost rings, splinters bite, gifting her a bead of blood that looks black in the guttering lamplight from the dormitory. A single blanket slides to the floor, a hush of wool against plank. No footstep follows, yet the chalk outline gains a companion. A second silhouette, smaller, arm half raised, drawn by condensation on the lime wash rather than chalk. Frost bridges the gap between the 2 shapes, knitting them fingertip to fingertip. Felicitas feels the freeze travel through the wall, through the air, into the bones she has vowed to keep obedient. She lifts her bleeding finger, signs the ledger page with a smeared cross, and closes the book on the wet mark before it can dry. The page sticks, sealing tomorrow's numbers inside today's sin. Outside, the gate finally swings, not outward but inward, as though the wagon has returned already unloaded. Its hinges scream once, then accept the dark. Supper ended with crusts sharp enough to cut gums and a prayer that clung like dry meal to the vault of Aurelia's mouth. Tallow smoke, thick as scalded milk, drifted between the beams until candlefire looked drowned. Along the flagstones, the youngest orphans knelt, knees squeaking on sifted salt, and slid copper pennies onto one another's shuttered eyes. Their dirge had no words, only the wet click of tongues mimicking the funeral responses they had never been invited to sing. Lena lingered by the kettle, tallying steam in pairs. Each hiss smelled of iron and yesterday's broth. She watched Rowan press a breadcrumb star into his own palm, then shut his fist as though to keep the constellation from escaping. When he took the circle, the toddlers crawled beneath him, tugging bootlaces like reins, begging the pretend dead to rise and gallop. Their chant sank to a lull, then lifted, rocking the refectory beams until the wood answered with a groan older than any hymn book. Sister Felicitas entered, left thumb unconsciously printing a bruise of ink on her apron hem. One pair of bluchers stood tongue out at the hearth, owner swallowed by the game. She tasted iron in the air, the same tang that had fogged the wagon gate at dawn and retreated before the children's pennies could cool in her pocket. Wind smacked the copper pump outside. Inside, the coins kept their vigil, frosting to the eyelids they covered. Rowan's braid glimmered like a fuse. No one dared snuff. Calder appeared atop a saw crate, brass pocket scale burnished to mirror the candle flame. He laid a day-old loaf against a gold eagle until the beam nodded perfect balance. His murmur praised divine economy. Wheat surrendered for immortal coin. Flesh quietly weighed against sustenance. Hunger widened every pupil. Wonder kept them seated. Aurelia, behind the hatch, felt the lost boy's hymn slip from memory, like snow melt down a drain. In its place, the scales click settled, bead after cold bead against her ribs. Yet cedar-scented coats arrived moments later, navy wool smelling of foreign lofts and looms. Gratitude sheared remorse clean off at the root. Felicitas ciphered the delivery against her ledger, lips moving in silent subtraction of bodies, saved versus bodies missing. Aurelia tucked a brittle marigold between lining and seam of the first coat, pressing consent petal by petal. Calder snapped the scale shut. The sound cracked through the haze like a distant gate closing on a quarry. Frost sketched a fresh outline on the refectory pane, smaller than the chalk ghost already haunting the dormitory wall. The orphans filed to vespers, palms freckled with wax, knees powdered by salt. Aurelia lifted the monstrance. Candlelight jittered across her cracked lens like coins sliding into darkness. Behind the tabernacle, Calder lowered the iron lid. The clang ricocheted, swallowing every Gloria before it could flower. Latin syllables stuck to her tongue like dry bread. She tasted rust where Amen should have been. Felicitas crouched beneath the lectern, sliding the day's ledger beneath her apron. The quill's nib pricked a punctuation of blood through the linen. Across the nave, the youngest boy still sprawled in mimic death, pennies shining like frozen tears. Calder's shadow crossed him without slowing. The sacristy door exhaled pitch. Aurelia's hand lifted toward the child, then faltered, fingers only stirring dust motes that rose and resettled like guilty conscience. Behind the altar, the strongbox locked with a note deeper than any bell. Tallow gutters wept onto stone. Felicitas remained, thumb marking a wet cross that would never dry, ears ringing with columns of figures and iron weights. The boy finally stirred. Coins spun, winked, rolled toward the sacristy where no footstep answered. Aurelia watched from the doorway, lungs rattling like loose brick in a chimney. The sanctuary lamp swayed on its chain, hinge crying for oil, flame teetering on the lip of an unpronounced amen. Calder's study smelled of tallow, iron, and chalk. The grate hissed as frost sealed the sash. Coals popped like distant rifles, each crack echoing off mahogany shelves, crammed with ledgers. Rowan knelt on a threadbare rug, copper braid trailing like a slow-burn fuse, while he mapped 7 stars across a slate shard. His thumb smudged chalk into Orion's belt. He bit his lip, remembering the sailor's tale that the constellation steers wanderers home. Calder entered without footfall, brass shears ticking against his belt buckle. The envoy's cuffs glimmered damp from scullery steam, and his spectacles rode low, catching firelight in twin coins of glare. "Show me the north you reckon," the envoy murmured, offering a sheet white as salt. The boy accepted, fingers trembling. Paper meant wages, meant horizon. Behind him the shears opened with a sigh, then closed, snick severing the braid at the nape. Weightless filament coiled into the scale dish, cooling to a crimson spiral. Opposite it, a silver eagle settled, wings gleaming against the hair. The needle dipped, steadied. Calder hummed approval and inked stern paid beneath yesterday's tally. Rowan felt only the paper, already plotting sextant angles across imaginary oceans. Calder rotated the scale, letting the boy's hair glide under lamplight. A single strand lifted, caught draft from the flue, and drifted like ember ash before settling on the envoy's knuckle. He tucked it beneath the coin, the way card sharps hide an ace. Then he uncorked a jar of powdered gum arabic and dusted the braid's cut end. The hair drank the pale grains and dulled to brick red, sealing value against future fray. Raoun noticed none of it. He had penciled a compass rose and was now scoring the slate's edge to mark cardinal points. Outside, Lena lowered her slop pail. Suds stank of rusty potato peel. Through the keyhole drifted a German lullaby. Zwei fünf. Acht numbers counted off like rosary beads. She pressed her cheek to the chilled brass, breath blooming frost that spelled no name. Inside, Calder slid two gold eagles beside the severed coil. Testing the scale's grin, one filament, snagged earlier from Rowan's collar, glittered against her cuff scarlet as sunrise caught in frostbite. She tucked the thread beneath fabric like a private pulse. Boot steps scuffed. Brother Matthäus approached, murmuring Benedicite. Lena wiped the pain with her sleeve, erasing the ghosted cipher, and hoisted the pail so quickly, suds slapped her skirt like tiny waves. When the brother's silhouette vanished, she exhaled, watched frost reclaim the glass. Dawn's first blade slipped between the panes, slicing corridor boards into ghosts of themselves. She rehearsed the lullaby as code. Zweistirner equals two eagles, hair equals coin, coin equals absence. Every line cracked like thin ice beneath her thoughts. Heat from the study bled through the wall, warming the wallpaper until its fleur-de-lis pattern sagged and glistened like wet straw. Rowan's new coat, issued before sunrise, hung from a peg. The empty sleeves still carried chalk dust on the cuffs. Calder lifted the coat, folded it, and laid it atop a trunk whose lid was stenciled with a flax threshing cooperative's emblem. He aligned the garment so the braid's former owner could later dress without snag, a courtesy that looked like tenderness unless one knew the ledger. Lena drifted back toward the window. Ice lacework veined the inside pane, and her breath purled along each vein, widening cracks until the glass seemed ready to hatch. She traced letters with a fingernail. ZWEI, the watery strokes bridged, then sagged under their own thaw. Behind her, chapel boards creaked under the weight of cold alone. No one walked, yet the sound advanced. She imagined Calder's shears traveling corridor after corridor, snipping futures shorter. Somewhere behind her Calder snapped the ledger shut. Brass hinges yawned, coins clinked, chair legs scraped like a gavel. She quickened step until tallow smoke no longer followed. At the corridor's end, a door stood ajar. Through it, she glimpsed Rowan's new coat hanging empty, sleeves lifted by draught as though still expecting the boy's wrists. The chapel bell tolled prime, strokes counting children who no longer answered. Lena pressed her palm to the cold pane, skin sticking, fingerprints smearing soot snow into blank silver. A single drop of meltwater slithered down, erasing the last trace of her cipher, while the red filament clung to her cuff, refusing to disappear. Beyond the glass, the orphan yard lay still, frost feathers overlaying yesterday's smaller silhouette, ghost upon ghost, none of them hers to name. Sister Felicitas's boot soles peeled from April mud with a sound like wet linen tearing. Iron wagon bells clanged against the market's lone church peal, two tones grinding in her skull like mismatched gears. She tasted rust, tallow, and some hum on the air, a cocktail of iron and incense that coated her tongue thicker than the communion wafer she had swallowed at dawn. Every breath carried the sourness of churned earth and the sweet stink of frightened livestock, vapors rising in slow, ghost-like spirals from the hoof-pocked slurry. Cora Bramble stood on the auction slat, copper braid glinting beneath her bonnet, while she praised the teeth of a leggy colt. Her gloved hand lifted the animal's lip as though she meant to bless it, yet her eyes slid sideways, counting coins no one else could see. Felicitas stepped between hoof-churned ruts and asked after the orphan boy whose name had vanished from the roll. Cora answered smooth as harness soap that she had bought no lad, only a colt, and suggested the sister had deciphered her own ledger. The denial arrived with such rehearsed ease that Felicitas felt the market itself exhale in collusion. A single lung of damp wool and denial. Vendors who moments earlier barked prices now studied, drifting cloud ash, or their own cracked boot toes. A wagon wheel crushed a fresh red hair into the slurry. The color bled like communion wine thinned with rain. No one flinched. Even the flies seemed contractually obliged to look away, clustering instead on the colt's lash-striped flank where sweat mapped white rivers across brown hide. Felicitas felt the market's shared shrug settle on her shoulders, heavy as empty flour barrels. She purchased a scrap of cold fodder receipt from a clerk whose stylus shook, ink blurred where hooves had already stomped tomorrow's proof into pulp. The paper cost her 2 coins warm from her sleeve, yet it felt colder than the mud creeping over her ankles. Thunder muttered beyond the leaning steeple, sounding like cannon no parish map would admit. The auction bell stilled when Calder's polished scale flashed inside his coat, weighing nothing the crowd would confess. Behind her, Silas Bramble sang Psalm 47 in a low carpenter's hum while chalk squealed tally marks for every lash dropped on flaxen backs. He reckoned 7 strokes for a boy who staggered beneath a sack, then scrawled the stroke as though heaven itself balanced cruelty on slate. Each mark produced a puff of white dust that clung to his cuff like displaced starlight, a perverse constellation kept in worsted wool. Felicitas offered gutta percha crucifixes for winter fodder. The farmer ciphered metal weight, not devotion, and slid her a second receipt already freckled with barley dust. Boys kept hauling, spines bowed like question marks. Each stagger drew another chalk hiss, another soft verse about stars being told and numbered. Their bare feet slapped the planks, skin wax yellow against the darker grain, sounding out a rhythm older than any auctioneer's cry. One child's breath clouded in the cold that should not belong to April. The cloud rose, met the market's general haze, and disappeared, unwitnessed. The livestock pen stank of spoiled mash and wet rope. Frost silvered the slats, though the calendar swore it was spring. Felicitas stepped through the gate's half-moon shadow, boots printing denial in miniature lakes that reflected a bruise-colored sky. Somewhere inside the maze of hurdles, a lamb bleated once, a fragile note snapped off short, leaving silence that felt premeditated. She felt the counterfeit receipt crinkle against her palm, its edges already softening into pulp, evidence turning back into the anonymous fibers from which it came. She walked the sunken lane, counterfeit receipt folded so tight it cut her palm like paper. Iron-rimmed wheels thundered after her, 3 wagons bound west, tarps flapping like black wings, dust lifted, tasting of rust and tallow smoke. Hymnals inside thudded together like damp hearts. A single strand of copper hair fluttered from a cart nail, caught the last sun, then dissolved into chalky plume. The drivers swore by St. Christopher. They hauled only seed corn and harness leather. Their laughter cracked across the ruts, syncopated with hoofbeats that matched her pulse more surely than any compliant bell. Felicitas walked faster, paper clenched like a sacrament that might yet transubstantiate, though the ink already sweated pale. A driver glanced back, touched whip to brim in mock blessing, then snapped leather so the wheels rolled on, prayerless. She felt the thrum of those wheels inside her ribs, a secondary heart that accused with every revolution. Roadside reeds bent in the wake of the wagons, bowing too late to hide the rut-bound hair, the straw, the silence. Accusation trailed behind the wagons like receding liturgy. fading toward the horizon where the orphanage chimney should have stood, but showed no smoke. Felicitas stopped where the lane forked toward the river, receipt now damp with blood ink and fear. The last wagon crested the ridge, rattling its cargo of silence and straw. The red thread on the nail was gone, unanswered, and the gate behind her stayed open like an iron mouth that had forgotten how to close. She unfolded the receipt one final time. The figures had bled together into a dark smudge, resembling a small, crouched figure, an accidental confession printed by sweat and friction. Overhead, the church bell rang once, late and off-key, a hollow note that rolled across the flats and died against the wagon's dust, leaving her alone with the taste of tallow, rust, and a forgiveness that would never arrive. The chapel's final antiphon clung to the vault like damp wool, refusing to dry. Felicitas waited until the last sandal vanished, then pried floorboard 7. The nail yielded a sigh that sounded almost contrite. Beneath lay a folio, waxed the color of old brews, exhaling cellar mold, and unrecorded sin. She cracked the seal. The snap darted along her ribs. Palimpsest ghosts, names scoured by pumice and dread, hovered beneath fresh tallies that weighed boys by stone, girls by sheaf. Harvest moons and planting feasts marched in shrinking margins, as though parchment itself were being rationed. A drop of tallow bit her knuckle. The small burn anchored her against dizziness. Rowan's ink, once copper plate, now bled to a watery spectre. 4 ounces hair, no body, price footnoted in the cipher of Crow's Ferry. She dipped a quill, wrote Domin non sum digna in a margin, letters trembling like knees at first confession. The scriptorium smelled of lanolin and smoke. Felicitas traced the erased columns with a fingernail, feeling ridges where the knife had skated too deep. Every obliterated name had left a scar, lighter than the surrounding skin of vellum, a infantile fingerprint pressed there by fear. She noted the pattern. Broad-shouldered boys vanished after the last sheaf was lifted. Fair-haired girls after the first seed was dropped. The margins shrank each year, columns marching inward, like frost closing on a pond. She copied the most recent entries into a smaller sheet, Latinizing the buyer aliases, Corvus, Lupus, Ursa, so that later she might speak them without tasting metal. When she lifted her hand, sweat had puckered the ink into tiny halos. A hinge cried twice, deliberate as a watchman testing guilt. Felicitas closed her fist around the candle flame, let the scorch kiss lifelines already scored by twine. Calder's shadow paused, brass key winked while he murmured a fictitious buyer for flaxen hair. Listening for her pulse to trip, she answered with borrowed calm, voice stolen from sleeping novices. His chuckle slid off abacus beads and retreated, leaving the latch squealing on purpose. An audible notch to remember. Cold iron exhaled down the corridor. Her habit pocket sagged with parchment heavier than any psalter. She climbed the door to stare sideways, shoulder-brushing stone so the folded sheet would not rustle. Each step conjured a new line of the ledger behind her eyes. Weight, color, date. Constellation. Halfway up, a migraine flared, bright as the candle she had swallowed. She pressed the heel of her hand to the socket until stars burst, then continued. The pain felt earned, a private stigmata no confessor would see. In her cell, she unfolded the folio on the writing ledge. The candle stub bruised the air. Ink pooled through linen, droplets pattering onto her thighs like the first rain of a storm no sky would claim. Dawn found the stain dried into a rigid child-shaped silhouette, head rounded, foot tapered, a negative crucifix. She crushed the fabric between damp palms, fibers parted like dry bone. The straw mattress received the folio with a rustle that sounded like pages turning themselves. Guilt nested there, warming to her body heat. A sparrow outside struck one high note, an accusation pitched beyond human range. The rising bell tolled. Bronze swallowed the last vibration before it could flee the tower. Felicitas dressed over evidence, surge sealing ink coffin against spine. Every breath lifted cloth and judgment together. Stones drank the echo of her sandals. each footfall a wet gavel testing hollow justice. At the chapel threshold she paused, letting frost nip ankles, half hoping pain might scrub the shadow off. Instead, the stain bloomed warmer, counting vertebrae like beads on an unspoken rosary. Incense rolled overhead, lavender laced with iron as though Calder swung the thurible himself. She pictured the ledger page curling beneath straw, edges thirsting for tomorrow's names, wondered how soon her own might be ciphered in obsidian. The cantor released a final miserere. The syllable hovered, unfinished, like a gate left wide tonight, wind still searching for its child. The aisle's chill crawled up her calves, coiling with the ink-warm ghost that pressed her backbone. She tasted iron, as if the stylus had left filings on her tongue. Behind the rude screen, a rat whisked straw, the same dry hiss the folio had made under her cot. Felicitas imagined the ledger's margins birthing new columns, each fresh vowel feeding like larvae on parchment already fretted by time. Calder's footsteps circled the cloister, slow, measuring. She could almost hear him tallying breaths instead of coins, testing who would break first. She stepped into the choir, knelt, and let the stained linen touch the stone. Cold conquering heat, or perhaps the reverse. The bell rope swung, idle but listening. Somewhere beneath flagging, the duplicate ledger waited for tonight's ink, and for her finger to trace again the rhythm of vanishing children. A draft lifted the hem of her gown, revealing the coffin-shaped blotch to the dark, and the chapel answered with a hush like held breath. The side chapel smelled of snuffed wick, wet iron, and midnight rain soaked into old velvet. Thunder prowled the ridge like a distant cannon. Each rumble shook dust from the rafters and set the hanging lamp swaying, a pendulum counting seconds no clock would confess. Aurelia's knuckles grazed her rosary, beads clicking like hail on a coffin lid while two altar tapers guttered, swallowed, and died, their smoke braided upward, brushing the tabernacle grill before thinning into nothing. From the sacristy floated a second flame. Calder's candle niffed the dark, slicing his face along a diagonal of polished copper. One eye gleamed, the other stayed a socket of night. He moved without footfall, cassock whispering against itself, and bent before the sacramental veil. Metal kissed metal 3 deliberate times, bright coins sliding home where only wafer and pyx belonged. The lock sighed open, cedar heat rushing out, scented faintly with incense, and something warmer that pulsed like a second, clandestine heart. Aurelia watched from the choir stall, lungs sawing on a narrow reed of breath. Each wheeze rattled the bones of her chest like a loose brick in a flue. Calder's gloved fingertip lifted a canvas sack heavy enough to bow the woven threads. Inside, eagles nested like matryoshka dolls, their minted stink sharp enough to taste. Atop the heap rested a strip of vellum. Ounces had replaced voices. Justice balanced on a scale stung. Her hand found the pocket of her scapular and closed on a marigold petal pressed there at midsummer. Now, in winter's dark, it bled saffron onto her thumb, a wordless confession staining the half-moon of her nail. Knees met flagstone with a dull report that shivered up her spine. The iron tabernacle key dragged her fingers earthward, heavier than any gold it promised to guard. She pictured the 6 absent voices, novices whose places at Vespers stood empty, psalms stolen by a ledger that balanced flesh with coin, and the key acquired a gravity no blessing could lighten. Lightning stitched sky to earth, bleaching the chapel so thoroughly that every crack in the plaster became a canyon. In the afterglow, Aurelia saw her own shadow kneel, a hunchback twin miming guilt. She rose, crossed herself, then crossed the aisle, soles finding cold splinters of glass from the rose window, shattered in last week's hail. Each shard kissed the bare skin of her foot, urging haste, drawing dark freckles of blood she barely felt. At the rainwater butt she paused. The surface smelled of cider left too long, sour and sweet at once. She opened her fist, let petal and key slip beneath the coppery scum. A muted bell sounded, the water closing overhead like a mouth swallowing evidence. Behind her, Calder's lantern jogged along the orchard walk, light leaping from puddle to puddle, each reflection round as a coin. She counted time in psalm verses. 3 verses before he reached the cloister arch, 2 before the lantern would sweep the lavoir, 1 before he might discover the box unlocked and the ledger breathing open. Ivy swallowed the white hem of her veil as she ducked beneath the low arch, leaves cold against her ears like phantom fingers. Inside the cloister passage, frost licked every stone, breath of the storm slipping through arrow slits long ago, filled with stained glass now mostly gone. Straw hissed beneath her sandals, a brittle applause for treason. Felicitas waited at the foot of the scriptorium stair, ink blotches on her gown forming the shape of a child's shadow. They traded silence sharp enough to slice lungs. Aurelia lifted the hem, traced the bruise-colored blot. "Evidence wears you," she whispered, voice no stronger than a taper in draught. Felicitas answered by unfolding the Latin cipher sheet kept tucked against her heart. Crows and wolves sketched in iron gall ink fluttered along the margins, wings alive in the cold draught. Together they climbed straw-pricking ankles until the daughter passage opened like a throat exhaling sleep. Novice snores rolled beyond half-latched doors, a chorus unaware its number had been diminished. From below rose Calder's soft interrogation. "Who counts the absent, sister?" The question settled on the stones, too polite to echo. Felicitas tucked the sheet beneath Aurelia's scapular, paper warm as a coal that branded them both with shared complicity. Aurelia slipped inside the cell row, leaving Felicitas alone with the bell rope that never rang and the frost that never thawed. She crossed to the narrow window overlooking the yard. Lightning flared again, a white blade cutting the night open. In its glare she saw Calder beside the pear tree, coat flung over his nightshirt, strongbox cradled against his ribs like a sleeping child. Rain sheeted sideways, wind shredded his candle, yet he moved with purpose toward the gate that yawned, unmanned, a mouth awaiting words. No wheeze could finish. A shard of red glass, host-shaped, slid from the sill and chimed once against the stone before the storm carried the sound away. Aurelia's breath rattled, harmonizing with wind-shattered stained glass, and she tasted iron, petals, and the first fierce tang of rebellion. Dawn smeared the stubble fields with a copper sheen. Each straw tip glowed like a fuse. Rowan knelt on the threshing planks, shirt borrowed, hair unbraided and licking his collar. Calder tested the shears. One hiss and the braid dropped. A stunned serpent, he weighed it on brass scales, then flicked it into the thresher. Iron teeth swallowed copper amid golden dust that climbed to meet the crimson sun. The planks vibrated through Rowan's knees, erasing who he had been. In a dented wash kettle, he saw a face that could be any hired boy's. He boarded the westbound wagon without looking back. The gate groaned, admitting one more replaceable body. Lina crouched on a hayrick, winding her own red thread thrice round her finger until the tip blushed. She swallowed any oath. The throb spoke for her. Across the track, Felicitas freed a second thread from a briar and tucked it inside her sleeve like a pressed flower of indictment. Their eyes met over drifting chaff, traded recognition. Then broke Calder, folded the shears into his coat, climbed to the driver's seat, and snapped the reins. The wagon lurched, Rowan's silhouette merged with the others, a single long shadow drinking the road. Tallow smoke from the orphanage thinned behind them, too weak to follow. Lena bit her thread. It snapped with a knuckle crack. She tasted iron, retied the knot, and began under her breath to list the names the parish registry had erased. Felicitas slipped her stolen thread into Isaiah between scarlet verses about sins like wool. In the shed's dim, the fiber glowed. A fuse laid against scripture. The wagon rattled on. Calder murmured a Latin blessing, then spat to keep it from sprouting. Rowan felt straw dust prickle through borrowed gloves. Minute accusations that had once been his braid, his mother's lullaby twist. Ahead, the horizon bled from copper to rose, as though the sun itself were being ground finer. Behind, the thresher cooled with small metallic clicks, and dust hung suspended. A sunrise pulverized beyond recognition. The dust stayed longest in the folds of Rowan's new collar. Each fleck was a syllable of the name he was told to forget. Calder kept the wagon in the ruts the August before had pressed. Horses leaned without whip, counting turns the way old monks tally beads. Rowan rehearsed the syllables Calder had whispered at dawn. Two short, one long. He felt them drain of taste like water dipped from a distant well. Overhead, a lark climbed, stalled, dropped mute into the chaff cloud, confused by the counterfeit storm. Beside him, a shorn youth rubbed the naked nape, scratched a freckle until it bled, and watched the spot dry brown against the thumbnail. It was proof the body could still spill, even when identity could not. Lena's recitation steadied her pulse. She spoke the erased names in time with her footsteps back toward the chapel, letting the bell's refusal become part of the meter. Felicitas closed the psalter, pressed it between milk boards so the verse would remember the thread's weight. She pictured judges in winter, breath white, pages falling open to that crimson hair of evidence. Calder calculated miles against dusk, fingers drumming the strongbox lid. He was unaware the absent key clicked only inside Lena's knuckles and Felicitas's page. Rowan tasted dust, tasted iron, tasted nothing that belonged to yesterday. He flexed borrowed gloves, felt straw prick, and thought of atoms, once braided, now riding the wind ahead of the wagon. They waited for some future gust to knit them into a shape no ledger would claim. The road curved west, the sun climbed higher, and the powdered sunrise followed like a rumor too fine to settle. Frost feathered the refectory's single unpatched pane, dawn leaking through milk-thin glass like whey left to sour. Sister Felicitas tasted iron where her lip had split overnight. The porridge spoon shook, mirroring a tremor she would never confess. A courier's boots, mud-rimmed white, halted at the oak board. An envelope slid across with the dull slap of sealed hide. Union scarlet wax glared against the grain, an eagle freshly branded into parchment skin. Mother Aurelia's spectacles fogged as she exhaled. For an instant the seal seemed to watch itself, twin raptors circling. Two novices let steam from their bowls rise like censers, yet no bell summoned courage to break the hush. Felicitas brushed the brass cuff of her habit, mind darting beneath floorboards where columns of names had been weighed as coin. The courier muttered, "Audit forthcoming," then withdrew, his greatcoat leaving a draught colder than the frost spidering inside the glass. Aurelia cracked the seal. Marshal Holt's reckoning spoke of souls balanced against shoes never returned. Steam filmed the porridge while 14 empty boots waited in the corridor, tongues gaping like unfed birds. She palmed the tabernacle key beneath a linen square. Metal still warm from guilty prayer, Felicitas covered it with her thumb, pretending to blot crumbs, while Calder's footfalls scraped the flagstones beyond the arch. He rehearsed, "Dia pacem Domini," yet the Latin arrived clipped, syllables counted faster than coins. The corridor smelled of cool tallow. Somewhere, a scythe hissed against stone, steel tasting the air. Night prayers ended early. The cracked bell coughed twice, omitting the third call that might have summoned witness. In the scriptorium, a lone candle bowed to drafts carrying rust and ink. Felicitas drew out the false bottom folio. Vellum crackled like distant skirmish fire. Fresh columns greeted her, no names, only numerals keyed to hair and boot size. A 4, beside straw 12, matched Rowan's missing braid. A 2 beside boot 6 fit Lena's barefoot print. Ink still breathed, warm enough to fog the parchment beneath her nose. Each digit stared pupilless. Footsteps approached. Calder hummed non nobis, the tune flattening as the latch lifted. She pinched the wick, smoke braided upward, carrying the scent of extinguished choirs. The ledger lay open, a gate yawning toward judgment, while she slipped into the cloister where night drafted its reckoning. Moonlight had shuttered itself. Only a wagon lantern glow sketched the yard. Below, Calder velvet-gloved slid map case and ferry timetable into the waiting bed, papers fluttering like moths before capture. The hiss of the closing latch sailed upward. Felicitas tasted rust at the back of her throat. She weighed 3 indictments in her palm: orphanage key, Latin folio, red thread, each balancing against a stack of Union Eagles. Calder glanced toward the window. His smile was a seam stitched by candle glow. He murmured that the river lay free of ice tonight. Then cracked reins, wheels spoke over gravel, counting coins no offering box had ever jingled. When the lantern shrank to ember, vapor spelled a child's vanished outline on the glass. Inside her cloak, the parchment crackled like scythes preparing harvest. Frost feathered her habit hem, writing verdicts one flake at a time. The corridor waited unlit, mouth open to swallow any sound. Behind tabernacle bricks, gold kept patient company with absent voices. Felicitas stepped forward, leaving the window ajar, night drafting its unfinished sentence through the orphanage bones. Frost crusted the barnyard like salt on iron, while Marshall Holt's spade rang against a pine box, no longer than a cradle. The lid split. River stones clattered out, sounding like dice, rolled across a hollow board. 5 more boxes lay beneath, edges already sealed by rime, their lids inked with birth months that no calendar would ever turn again. He knelt, breath clouding, and brushed snow from the nearest lid. The word March stared up, letters clumsy as if carved by a shaking hand. Beside it, April, May. Each crate staggered half a pace, right, forming a crooked calendar across the frozen muck. Inside the nearest, a hymn page fluttered, margins ruled with copper lashes Holt had seen in Felicitas's erased ledger. A red thread once braided into a child's hair clung to a coffin nail, twitching like an artery against bleached wood. Wind snapped it free and it drifted, refusing to leave his boot. He coiled the thread round his badge pin, sealing the omen in plain sight. Snow feathered through the broken roof, soft as baptismal wool, while thunder rolled beyond the ridge. Cannon or storm he no longer ciphered. He lifted one river stone. Damp earth bled through its pores, smelling of rusted sides and distant powder. The weight lied, promising flesh yet yielding only cold geology. He counted 20 stones, then 30, enough ballast to mimic a 7-year-old. Each thunk into the drift sounded like a heartbeat skipping its cue. Behind him, a lantern thudded to the ground. A farmhand fled toward pines, silhouette dissolving like spilled ink. Holt did not call. Pursuit could wait until evidence breathed. Instead, he pried the second crate. January. Inside, more stones, but also a rag doll, its calico face already blackened by thaw and refreeze. Button eyes stared, pupils askew, reflecting the marshal's own frost-rimmed spectacles. He left the toy where it lay. The mute witness felt heavier than any corpse. When he straightened, his knees cracked louder than the splitting wood, announcing age, announcing doubt. The farmhouse door gaped like a lung that had forgotten its next inhale. Inside, flax hung from rafters in brittle braids. Ghost oil from last summer clung like sin afraid to leave. Cora's sun-bleached bonnet lay inside out on the deal table. Crown slit, coin purses gutted, threads dangling like snapped nerves. Only dust spilled when Holt weighed the linen, soft as crematory ash. A salter sprawled nearby, spine cracked. Across the margin swaggered the penciled alias chaplain see a leader. Cedar shavings still smelled fresh enough to cut. The same ink loop Lena's 7s on Union rolls filed in Washington. Storm clouds piled above the sagging roof, boards ticking while wind tested each nail for weakness. Holt closed the salter, wrapped it with the bonnet in oilcloth, and stowed both. His coat suddenly hung like iron on his shoulders. He paused at the threshold, listening. No footfall, only the hymn of drafts threading broken clapboard, yet the quiet felt rehearsed, as though occupants had exited stage left moments before curtain. On the hearth, ash retained the shape of a single boot print, pointed toward the back door, toward the river, toward anywhere but here. Outside, whitening fields waited, their furrows half erased by drifting snow. He left the door unlatched. It rocked, creaked, froze half open, a mouth still asking whether Mercy ever stopped by for supper. Snow clawed the mare's flanks as they climbed the chapel ridge. The ruin of St. Agnes rose black against pewter sky. He ducked beneath a frost-barnacled lintel. Wind groaned through splintered pews in slow liturgical rhythm. Felicitas waited by the altar stump, veil hem iced to her ankles, ledger clutched like an uncreased child. She opened her left palm. Holt drew the red thread, hung it between them, a filament still smelling of coffin oak. Snow motes settled on the thread without melting, as though warmth itself recoiled from evidence. She laid it beside the folio bookmark. Hue, twist, dilaut, identical, then knotted the newcomer into the record spine. Candles bowed, weeping tallow onto flagstones. The thread flared, a crimson vein against guttering light. Wind punched the rose window. Glass shards chimed like scythes, falling in a constellation of knife-note stars. Neither moved to brush the slivers from their shoulders. Instead, Felicitas whispered, "He sails at dawn." Holt answered only with a nod, fingers already ciphering distances to the ferry road. Behind them, the altar cloth lifted, ghost-touched, then collapsed like a failed resurrection, while a single shard stood upright, catching starlight it would never return. The bell tolled, brass forged from Calder's own pocket scale, its clap swallowing the courthouse square. Marshal Holt marched the envoy up granite steps. Chain links clicked like rosary beads, each bead a child's name. Spectators crushed the gallery pews. Breath merged into one damp cloak that smelled of wet plaster, boot black, and tallow-tinged fear. Inside, Sister Felicitas slid the red-threaded ledger across the clerk's rail. Pages fluttered, dry leaves surrendering to a winter yet unnamed. Aurelia, veil askew, pressed cracked spectacles to her eyes and tried to cipher the first column of Latin weights. Calder stood shackled, yet upright, polishing an invisible coin against his thumb. The soft hiss was the only prayer he offered. Around him, orphans huddled on the hard bench, their boots too clean, their silence rehearsed. When the clerk lifted the first leaf, the bell outside stopped mid-swing. Silence hung heavier than irons. Ink spread across the clerk's thumb as he pinched the next page. The red thread marking Felicitas's place trembled like a vein. Calder's gaze drifted to the gallery, counting orphans the way a steward counts lambs. His lips shaped soundless fractions. A woman near the rail muffled a cough. The small bark vanished into stillness that followed the bell's last quiver. Marshal Holt shifted his weight. Boothiel rasped on pine boards, the single noise daring the room to breathe. The clerk let the page settle, its corners still lifting, as though the paper itself recoiled from what it held. Outside, the bell rope dangled, an empty noose against the morning sky. Spring sun slanted through high windows, catching dust motes like suspended coins above the witness box. The orphan children filed past the scarred railing. Their Latin lullabies served as testimony, syllables falling like coppers into an unseen coffer. Jurors leaned forward, a wheat field before an unseen scythe, ears straining to catch prices assigned to hair hue and wrist breadth. Calder's soft objection, non mercatio, sed ministerium, was sliced short by the judge's gavel. Beyond the plastered wall, the melted scale bell tolled again, a sound that tasted of rust and tallow smoke. The foreman rose before the closing benediction, his gaze already engraved with a verdict the room had not yet heard. A red thread slipped from Felicitas' cuff and coiled at her feet like a question mark no one dared voice. Outside, the courthouse gate yawned open to an empty street, its iron jaw awaiting the next coin of silence. Snowflakes drifted through the open transom like slow confetti of guilt, while the jurors filed back, boots sounding on fresh-planed oak. The foreman lifted the paper but could not steady it. The rustle carried every child's name the court had refused to utter. Guilty, 20 years. The words struck stone and returned as echo hollow as an upended bell. Felicitas stepped among the masons, kneeling along the rising wall, slapping grey mortar with trowels still sticky from St. Agnes bricks. She drew from her sleeve the same red thread Lena had knotted years ago, now faded to drought-struck clay, One mason glanced up. She pressed the thread into a seam still wet. Whispering requiescent, so low the mortar absorbed the Latin. Snow thickened, erasing boot prints before they fully formed. The courthouse bell tolled 12, iron tongues striking metal forged from Calder's confiscated brass scale. The clang scattered pigeons and debtors alike. Names that should have been carved on the adjacent plaque remained absent. The granite face stayed blank as the sleepwalker's gaze. Flakes settled into those shallow vacancies, piling into small white mouths that could not close. Wind rose, threading between scaffold poles, sounding like unpaid notes of compound interest. Felicitas lifted her hand. The thread had frozen rigid, a scarlet filament trapped mid-sentence inside the wall. Behind her, workers shouldered their hods and withdrew, leaving the joint unfinished, the mortar already skinning with cold. Years later, in a potter's field beyond the river, a blank granite plaque waited beneath drifting snow. No chisel had marked it. The silence itself kept ledger of the missing. Wind whistled through that engraved absence, an unclosed mouth of history, while across the valley the courthouse bell struck the hour with Calder's former scale, ringing both judgment and complicity into the winter air.